So today, our event is video recorded. There is pictures that are also being taken. And if you want to have access to simultaneous translation, there are headsets available probably in front of the room. Yes, just over there. So you can grab, and the service will be available in French as well as in English. And today we are in for a real treat about rethinking Latin America's rural shift. And we have a set of three distinguished colleagues with us from the Latin American Center for Rural Development, or better known under the acronym of Rimisp. Now, don't ask me Rimisp stands for what. It might be written somewhere, but it's Red Integral. I know, I never remember it. So, let's just. So we are joined by Ignacia Fernandez. Ignacia, welcome. Angela Penagos. Angela, welcome. And my old friend Julio Berdegué. And also with us on the podium is Dominique Charon, the Director of the Agriculture and Environment Program here at IDRC, that will moderate the question period after the presentation of our three distinguished guests. Now, I'm stepping aside from the formality over here because I've known Rimisp for way too long to step to my text. This organization is a child of IDRC. 1986, we provided the first grant to work on agricultural system in Latin America. And, we were all proud and trumpeting about the beauty of this organization. But, organizations like IDRC face difficulties. Sometimes the fiscal context of a country is not good. And in the early 90s, we had our share of challenges, and we suffered from significant cutback from our, parliamentary allocation. And what did we do? Well, we reduced our funding to numbers of organizations. So, yes, we gave birth to Rimisp, but we almost killed them by pulling out our funding. And Rimisp at that time was very vulnerable because we were the only donor, only granting agency that was supporting their excellent work. Now, we're saying at IDRC that we're a learning institution. And we learned from Rimisp because Julio was heading the institution at that moment, said, never again in my life will I depend on only one donor, even if he comes from Canada. This is too risky. So for rural territorial development. And this, they will talk of today, has led them to play key role in development of, the Mexican Plan for Rural Development based on sound science, have led to an active participation in the Colombia peace process with a dimension of the rural world being quite important in the negotiation, and similarly in Chile with empowerment of people. So why am I stepping out of my text to tell you this story? Is to tell you the story of IDRC and how we work with our partner. We like to work early on with good ideas. We like also to maintain our support over a long period of time despite, hiccup. But we want to not only to reinforce the intellectual and the research work, we want to reinforce organization. And the last grant that we made to Rimisp was a significant one, about $10 million. You're going to say, wow. But it was over many years. And it was not only to do programmatic research, it was also to strengthen the organization in order to build a cadre of experts, not only one leader. It was about to have an institution that has strong financial system, strong evaluation system, strong governance system, and also a succession plan. Because too many of our organizations that we are supporting often rely simply on one great leader, and when the great leader goes, the institution goes with it. This is not the situation of Rimisp. Rimisp invested extensively in talent. And today, with us, is the not-so-new director, because she was appointed a year and a half ago, Ignacia Fernandez, as well as Angela, her colleague, and the former leadership in Julio that I've known for some years. So you have here, for IDRC colleagues and our guests from outside, a perfect illustration of our work. It's about the research, it's about the production of knowledge, but it's also about the organizational straightening and securing that what we are supporting lasts in time, and not only with Canadian dollar. Rimisp is a sustainable organization with many sources of revenue as a think tank, or a do tank, as I prefer to call them, that make a real change. And to see those change, I will let Angela, Ignacia, and Julio tell you the story, because it's a real pleasure for me to welcome them over here at IDRC. And in his Rimisp incarnation, probably his last visit, Julio. But now that he's the FAO director for Latin America, I'm sure we will have many other years of interaction. So without any further ado, c'est un grand plaisir pour moi d'accueillir les gens.
It's a great pleasure for me to welcome the people from Rimisp, an organization we've been supporting for more than 30 years, which has on many occasions demonstrated its leadership in terms of development, economic growth, equity, and environmental sustainability. So, Julio, it's up to you to start.
For your attendance. It's Ignacia?
Yes.
Oh, my God, you know my notes. So I should. Ignacia, you're going to lead us into the conversation with the presentation. Thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you, John.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I want to... No, what?
Mejor. No te están oyendo.
No? Hello?
Okay, now
yes, it is. Yes? Okay. Okay, again, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I want to start thanking... You can't see them. Yes, thank you. To start thanking Jan for these more than kind words about Rimisp and the work we have been doing in partnership with IDRC during all these years. I want also to introduce, not Julio because you know her, but Angela. Angela is the director of our office at Colombia. Well, now for us it's extremely important to be here with you, to have the opportunity to have this substantive dialogue about the work we have been doing with you, to talk with IDRC and with Canadians interested and involved in the issues of international development, about the work we are doing with your support during all these years, but particularly the last 2 years under the Transforming Territory program. It's a pleasure, a real pleasure to share with you the work we are doing. The Transforming Territory program is funded by IDRC. As some of you maybe know, this is a program started in 2016 that seeks to promote socially inclusive growth in rural territories in Latin America. We will organize this presentation in 3 parts. First, Julio will start to talk about the program, some of the more recent research we have been doing under this program. Then Angela will present some of concrete examples of the work we are doing in support of policy process in Colombia. The program has designed to generate knowledge, but as we also said in Rimisp, we do not only work to generate knowledge by itself, but also to inform the design and implementation of policies and programs that improve the opportunities and well-being of rural population all around Latin America. So what Angela will tell us about the work we are doing in Colombia, a country that has recently achieved a peace agreement that will be the end of 50 years of violent conflict, told us about an enormous opportunity we have been constructing. We built together with the government, with you, and with our partners to improve the well-being of millions of men and women in the territorial post-conflict space of rural Colombia. And then after Angela's part of this lecture, I would like to finish with a brief reference to some of the most important changes in our internal trajectory organization that, as Jen has said, were really founded by the IDRC's contribution and confidence of our capacities, our organizational possibilities, and well, we will finish with a little reference to this internal process we have been during this time. So, Julio.
Thank you. Thank you very much, IDRC, for the invitation. My part of the presentation has to do with the research element of our work. I apologize that I cannot speak French. I could try Spanish, but I don't think that would work. But I apologize for not speaking your other language. The part of the research that I will try to present to you, and parts of it, has to do really with the recognition that we and others have had in Latin America for quite some years that, our lenses to interpret rural societies needed to be changed. That we were seeing, a very blurred image, that we somehow could not make sense of what was happening, and that the problem was not a problem that reality was going wrong, but that we were using the wrong lenses, that we needed to change our glasses because societies changed, and our ways of interpreting those societies needed some improvement. That's the fundamental story of our work that we've been doing with the support of our Canadian friends and the Canadian taxpayers that were very mindful of that. This is an image taken from satellite and Google Earth type of information of a part of Mexico. It's a part in the central sector of Mexico called the Bajío region. All right? The large yellow dot spot there at the middle is a city of about 1 million inhabitants called Querétaro. Right? All of these little dots, red or black, the color doesn't make any difference. It's just to make it easier for you to see, are hamlets and villages, rural villages. You see all over the map other yellow spots, which are all other cities. Some a bit large, others smaller, some quite small, from 15 to 20,000 to 1 million in this image, right? The bands here, white, yellowish, and green, are travel times from downtown Querétaro. 30 minutes, 60 minutes, 90 minutes. You can see that just about every single rural village is within 30 to 60 minutes of a city. A large one, a small one, a medium one. The people that live in these rural villages, we call them rural because their house is in a rural village. But they go to school in the city. They buy and sell in the city. Many women go to work in the city. Right? They depend on the city to trade the agricultural produce they produce. And if we look at the urban people, well, that's also part of the story, right? A large share, it turns out that a large share of farmers in Mexico, around 30% of the farmers in Mexico, large and small, are urban residents. Thousands and thousands of urban women go to the farm during the harvest season to harvest the strawberries here in Irapuato that are shipped to Canada so you can buy them in your Ottawa supermarket. They're urban residents, rural workers, part of the year. The shopkeepers, the lawyers, the accountants, the mechanics in the city, a big part of their business is done with rural clients. So are these people rural, or are these people urban? Or are they both? The way these people live their life, partly in a village, partly in a city, weaves a dense network of interdependencies between the urban and the rural. So that it's very difficult to say these people are rural and these people are urban. They're actually both, partly both. This is the face of contemporary rural Latin America. And this is the face also of contemporary Asian rural areas, and increasingly so of African rural areas. This idea that rural and urban are distant, opposites, don't touch each other, are almost contradictory terms, is very, very outdated. Those are the glasses that we need to throw away and get new glasses. Because using this urban-rural dichotomy is the same as if we were using Dickens' description of London to think about a city in the 21st century. So that is the story I want to tell you about. That story is driven in part because of this enormous process of urbanization. Right? It's happening, the century of the cities, etc. We read all over the place. And yes, of course, there is a large process of urbanization, and Latin America is the most urbanized developing region in the world. In fact, we're as urbanized as North America and as Europe. 85% of our citizens live in cities, officially designated cities. But the image that Latin American urbanization is Sao Paulo and Mexico City and this monstrous megalopolis is really very misleading. Because what you see here, right, is that in Latin America, most people live in cities that are fewer than 500 inhabitants, 500,000 inhabitants. Most of them are there. The very, very large cities have far fewer urban people. It's not only Latin America. Look at Asia. 900 million Asians live in cities of less than 500,000 people. If you then add the Asian cities of more than 10 million and the Asian cities of more than 5 million, there's 500 million urbanites in Asia living in the large cities. Yeah, we'll give them time to get the visuals right.
We're too green.
Yes. He's an environmentalist. So 900 million Asians in small cities, 500 million Asians in small cities. So this idea that urbanization is about the monstrous cities of today is only partly correct. By the way, most of the urban poor in Latin America and also in the world are also in these smaller cities, not in the slums of Jakarta or Mumbai, as we probably think. Most of these small and medium cities are really densely networked with the rural surroundings, thanks to what in the literature are called rural-urban linkages. These are nothing more than flows of people who live here and work there, goods, services, environmental services, money that moves between the urban and the rural. And this creates, when these flows occur between a small and medium city and their proximate rural surrounding areas or hinterlands, you basically create an interdependency. If you prevented any of these villages in the first image of the Bajío, you prevented these images, any of these villages, from trading, working, moving to the city, these villages would die. And many of the urban areas, if not all of the urban areas, if you prevented them any contact with the rural countryside around them, these cities would also suffer greatly. They are interdependent. And because of this interdependence, they constitute what we call a rural-urban territory, functional territory, or a society which is really at the rural-urban interface. Another powerful driver of the formation of this rural-urban interface and the growth of this rural-urban interface is a process that is known as the structural transformation. We're taking this graph from a work done by IFAD, the International Fund for Agricultural Development, published last year. It's called the Rural Development Report. We contributed to that report. And this graph, it's a little bit complicated. I'll walk you through. Every one of these dots is a developing country. All right? This is not the history of Europe or North America. These are developing countries in more or less 2015. It may vary the year a little bit because of the data differences. But recent data for 60 developing countries. This horizontal axis is the GDP. As you move to your right, correct? Your right, yes, means that the countries are richer. These are developing countries, but they're richer. The vertical axis is the share of agriculture. Share of what? Well, if you look at the orange dots, is the share of agriculture in the country's total employment. How much of the total jobs in the country are in agriculture? The bright blue dots is the share of agriculture in the total GDP, the total economy, right? What you see is that as the countries, developing countries, become more developed, the share of agriculture in employment and in GDP decreases. But the interesting part is down here, the light blue dots. The light blue dots represent the difference between the share of agriculture in the economy minus the share of agriculture in employment, right? What this tells you, what this graph tells you, is that as developing countries are in the initial stages of development, quite poor, there's a lot of people employed in agriculture, but the average productivity of each of them is quite low, right? And as the country develops, the average productivity of people in agriculture grows. So that, in the end, over time, the productivity of people in the countryside tends to converge with the average productivity of people in the city. Tends to converge. In Canada, for example, the average productivity of a person living in Brandon, Manitoba, which is a city in what we would call the rural-urban interface, is not too different from the average productivity of a person living in the rural municipal district of Foothills, Alberta. The productivity would look quite similar. If we go back to Canada 100 years ago, the productivity of people living in the countryside in Canada and those in Toronto would be huge. So what does this mean for our story? That the rural-urban interface, the growth of this rural-urban interface, is not only about the integration of space and people. It's also a story of economic transformation. The economies of these rural-urban areas is not an economy that is purely rural, nor is it an economy that is purely urban. It's something different. It's different. And we know that this is, I think, an important story. For example, we cannot expect to achieve much in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals if we don't take into account these rural-urban societies. Look at these numbers. 73% of the world's population, 85% of the global extreme poor live in these rural-urban territories. Essentially all of the land in this planet. 59% of the greenhouse emissions are there. We cannot deal with the SDGs if we don't take these societies into account. For example, poverty. Most of the poor in the world are here. Goal number 1. Goal number 6, water. This is where a lot of our water comes from. This is where a lot of our water is consumed. This is where a lot of our water is polluted. Economic development and decent jobs, goal 8. Industrialization. What does industrialization have to do with the rural story? Well, you don't see many factories in downtown Toronto, nor do you see many factories in rural Nunavut. Most factories are actually in this rural-urban space, in between the purely urban and the very, very distant and isolated rural. Urbanization. Why urbanization? Goal 11. Because we've seen that the vast, vast majority of cities in the world are these small and medium cities. And the majority of the urban people live in this rural-urban interface in small and medium cities, and so on. We cannot expect to go very far in terms of the SDGs if we don't pay attention to these rural-urban areas. So I hope by now I've given you sufficient evidence to agree that there is something out there that we need to understand better and to look at in depth. This is what IDRC has been encouraging us and helping us to do. Well, but life is not easy. Data, this is Mexico, and data in our countries are not nicely organized by rural-urban territories. Data is organized by individuals, by households, by districts or municipalities, by provinces, by countries. Right? So to start with, we don't even know where one rural-urban area starts and the next one ends. If we want to know how they change and what these changes mean for the livelihoods of real people living there, we first need to find these territories because they don't come in the data that the ways our countries organize. So what we do is we're using satellites to find them. We're starting with Mexico, Chile, and Colombia. This is Mexico here. What you have here is, let's see if I can go where? Forward? Yeah, here we go. What you have here is an image of Mexico, and these are nighttime lights as captured by a satellite. All right? Most of the people in Mexico already have access to electricity. And people with electricity have the habit of turning the lights on at night. And every time they turn on the light, the satellite, boop, sees us. And if you live in a hamlet with 20 or 30 houses, there's certain light intensity which is low. And the satellite will know, okay, that's a low light intensity. But if you live in Mexico City, the lights will be amazing. And the satellite will say, there's a lot of light coming from this place. And this is what you see here, the hotspots of Mexico City, the Bajío region, and so on. So what do we do? That's step one, getting the lights, because the lights allow us to know exactly where people are, exactly where people live, with great, great precision, right? So that's step one. In step two, what we do is to say, okay, we turn now to more conventional data, although like Stephen McGurk was telling us, we're thinking of using new types of data. But so far, we're using quite conventional data, population census, economic census, the more traditional data that countries have, to try to figure out whether a person living in light spot 1 goes to work in light spot 2. Light spot 1 is a low-intensity place. We know it's rural. Light spot 2 is a high-intensity place. We know it's urban. So we track thousands and thousands and thousands and millions of these movements of people from one light spot to the other light spot, right, using conventional data. And therefore, we can say, by processing all of this information, we can say this is where one rural-urban territory begins and the next one ends, right? Because we know who's communicating with who. Basically, labor commuting data. That allows us to produce these maps. These are all the functional territories in Mexico. And we have here, in green, the vast area of the country is what we call deep rural. Places which are quite distant, quite uncommunicated. Does that word exist in English? Well, they're not well communicated with urban areas, right? A lot of space, very few people, only 7% in the green areas. 43% of the population live in this rural-urban yellow. And half of the population is crowded in a very small area size, which is the urban red. Okay, and we can make a zoom and go back to our friend, the Bajío region. And here is the Bajío region. And we have here, for example, this is the functional territory, the dark lines. All of these people basically live in the same, make their life in this whole area. Here's the city of Querétaro with 8 municipalities which are all closely interconnected with that city of Querétaro. And here's the city of Irapuato with hundreds and hundreds of villages. There's another city right here, which is Abasolo, another small city. And we know that all of these people really work together, hire each other, buy from each other, work here and live there, etc. That's the space in which they conduct their life. Okay? We do that in Colombia, the same. This is Colombia, the night lights, the map. This is a bit more rural. 19% of the Colombians live in deep rural green areas compared to 7% in Mexico. But the same story. Here's a zoom. This is the coffee for those of you who know Colombia. This is Pereira, Manizales, where they grow all the wonderful coffee that we drink. This is a big, big city region of Bogota. So now, in this way, we have identified the subject of our work. We have found these rural-urban territories. That's not really what is very important. That only allows us to start working. What is really important is to answer 2 questions. First, how are these rural-urban territories changing, and what is driving that change? And second, the even most important question is how are these changing affecting the opportunities and well-being of the people that live in these places? That's what we're really interested in, right? So here we have the urban-rural territories of Colombia. On your left is, forget about the methods, but basically this is telling you a story about economic dynamism. The darker blue, the better. Okay? These dark blue places are places which in the last 5 years have really been growing. Economic growth, only economic growth. On your right is a slide which is more or less the same story, but this is about social inclusion. It's a number of indexes, poverty, participation of women in the labor market, a number of indicators that we bring together that tells us a story about social inclusion. The darker green, the better. If you look at both areas, the light colors actually have you, I don't know if you can see, but the lighter colors actually have some negative numbers. So these are rural territories, and some rural-urban territories are going back in terms of economic dynamism. And some of them are also going back in terms of social inclusion. So being a rural-urban territory is not the key to development. There's something more to the story. It takes more than having a city in your neighborhood to actually develop. Okay? And then, of course, the obvious step is to merge these 2 maps. And this is a map, again, of Colombia. Dark green are places where we have economic dynamism, increased economic dynamism, and increased social inclusion. A good number of those in Colombia. Good for them. However, a lot of reds. No economic dynamism, no social inclusion. The light yellow, economic dynamism, with no social inclusion, our well-known adversary. And the light green, or the yellow, sorry, light green and yellow is the opposite, economic dynamism and no social inclusion. So now, okay, what we want to know is why. How come a certain place is red or green or light yellow, right? And more important, how do we turn a red into a dark green? What are the policies necessary to support these places which are not doing so well for doing better? Well, we're just starting. I don't have the program is only 1 year old. You'll have to invite Ignacia and Angela next year to tell you how this story ends. But I can tell you right now what we're looking at the interaction of 3 factors. These are 3 key characteristics of the rural transformation in contemporary societies. First, urbanization patterns. How are cities growing? And more important than how cities growing at, what are the functions of the city? Is this an agro-industrial city? Is this a tourism city? Is this a city that provides logistics? What is the function of the city? Second, how food systems are changing, from production to processing to logistics to transformation. A lot of agriculture in these places. Much of the services that agriculture needs depends on the city. Is the city providing financial services? Is the city providing access to knowledge? Is the city providing access to markets? How? And finally, changes in the labor markets. Because we know that as these societies transform, their labor markets in these rural-urban societies also change. This is a story that we've known for quite some time. This is all data. This is all work that we did. But basically what it tells you, 1990, 2012, and the change. Country by country, what we see is an increase in the share of people that are in rural areas but are holding non-farm jobs. Very large and very fast increases. There's a few countries which are moving in the opposite direction. Well, one country, Nicaragua. But most countries are very, very fast pace of development of non-farm jobs in these rural-urban societies, right? Now, this is very important. This is a hugely important story from the perspective of gender equality and women's participation in the economy and in societies. This is Colombia, only 1 year, 2013. This very dark color, don't worry about the numbers. This very dark color, male and female, are the share of those men and women working in agriculture. You can see that most men are farmers or farm workers. There's a good number of women in agriculture, but most women are in commerce, manufacturing, or services. These opportunities for women have changed in these rural-urban societies. The structure of the labor market has changed, and the paths taken by men and women are different. We need to know this story. We don't understand it well yet. But this is crucially important so that these dark green territories are dark green for both men and for women. Because the average might be dark green, but we don't know how that green is split between men and women. We must get that story right. Of course, we will be looking at what happens to smallholders, smallholder farmers, peasants, right? How they are affected by these very rapid and very deep changes. There's a lot of people, probably some of you, who believe that this very rapid transformation of rural societies are essentially anti-small farmer. You know, that these are like huge tidal waves that basically destroy the livelihoods of these people. So here we took Chile. Why Chile? Because Chile with Uruguay are the two countries that are further down the road in this process of rural transformation and rural urbanization, as we call it. So we're seeing, you know, an advanced story of what will probably happen in many other countries. What do we have here? 1990, 2013, so almost 25 years. These bars represent the number of smallholder farmers in gray, the number of commercial farmers, and let's forget of the orange to not make the story too much complicated. The orange is farm workers. But let's just compare medium commercial farmers with smallholder farmers. What happens as a country goes a super rapid, very deep transformation of the rural societies? What happens with the smallholders? Well, the smallholders do lose. You know, they start with 100. It's a relative measure here, right? And they go down to 75. So over 25 years, we lost in Chile 25% of the smallholders. They're someplace else. They're no longer smallholders, right? 25%. But look at the commercial farmers. 100% to start with, down to 35%. The medium commercial farmers. So this idea that all of this rural transformation is very good for commercial farmers but very bad for smallholders, well, at least not in Chile. it does look like smallholders are resilient, that smallholders can participate in this rural transformation. Some of them will get out of agriculture, but many of them, after 25 years, they're there. And they're very productive, and they're part of the transformation. So with that, I pass the floor to my dear friend and boss, Dr. Ignacia Fernandez.
El de abajo es el láser.
Y el del medio.
Sí.
Okay. Toma. Julio. Okay, thank you. Let me go a little deep in the gender analysis Julio has just introduced and tell you that since 2011, with the support of IDRC and also of IFAD, Rimisp publishes the Latin American Poverty and Inequality Report. The report documents trends in 6 dimensions of in poverty, education, health, economic dynamism and employment. This is one dimension. Income, public safety, and gender equity. In 10 Latin American countries, but not as national averages, but of each of thousands of municipalities or provinces or disaggregated spaces. In all of these dimensions of development, what we see is that national average conceals substantial differences between lagging territories and those that are most advanced in its countries. And the report tries to open this black box of the national average to make visible those substantial inequalities inside the different countries. Lagging territories, by the way, tend to be more rural than the advanced ones in every dimension and in every country. The 2015 edition of the report that you can see there focuses on gender inequality. And it argues that the opportunities for ensuring women's economic autonomy are distributed inequitably among the various territories within the countries. This not only affects the quality of life of women in lagging territories, but it also reduces the potential for economic growth and social inclusion for each of the countries as a whole, not only for women, but also for the country as a whole. Gender inequality, in terms of what we understood, of what we have worked, is related to one's own income and resources, economic autonomy we talk about. It's expressed differently in different territories because this inequality is related not only to the assets and resources that the women themselves by individuals or social group has, but also with the characteristics of the place they live, such as the economic structure, the formal and informal institutions, and also the type of actors active in each territory. Each of these structures, institutions, actors, structures itself, is gendered, that we say. It's gendered, and this often constrains and sometimes expands the development opportunities for both for women and for the territories where they live. We find in the report, in 2015 report, that those territories where we document that the economic autonomy of women has been expanded or is less constrained are those with 3 common characteristics. First of all, there are strong linkages to more dynamic markets in these territories. We find that women do better in the terms of their economic autonomy in environments of greater economic dynamism. Okay? Second, there are public policies, institutional dimension, that actively support the participation of women in the economy. So more dynamic economic is necessary, but not enough by themselves to open the door of the women of the same degree of men to opportunities. Third, these institutions, understood as, we say, rules of the game, including culture, norms, values, informal institutions that favor a more democratic distribution of power and ability to participate in decision-making for women. So let's make a little reference to some cases. The report documents real-life cases of rural territories to illustrate these arguments. Here you have the cases, 2 cases of Colombia. These reports talk also about cases in in Chile and in El Salvador. But here you have cases in Colombia. Both territories have been strongly affected by armed conflict, and although unemployment is a serious problem, transformation in the economy have created opportunities for new types of jobs for women in these territories. The transformation of the territory's economy has allowed women to enter new spheres and breathe new life into jobs that had been underappreciated, as well as to strengthen their ability to organize themselves. Also, women have entered into jobs that were traditionally dominated by men. In Nariño, for example, one of these cases we have studied, where most of the population belongs to an indigenous setting groups, women have found ways to add value to their cultural tradition also in this institutional, soft institutional dimension. In both cases, there are also public policies for gender equality that have been strengthened in a context of violence conflict. Some of these policies have strengthened women's association, often as an antidote for the prevailing violence. And in general, these policies in support for women address economic, personal, and political dimensions to take advantage of the collective space that the policies have created. The greater capacity to affect change that is acquired when women became organized and involved in local institutions has been key for closing these autonomy gaps. They have opened up job opportunities in the territory, taking advantage of them with an ability to act as interlocutors and participate in decisions about development. Despite these common elements, these general common elements, of course, each case shows different routes that each territory can follow to reduce gender gaps, demonstrating the diversity of ways of promoting territorial dynamics with greater gender equity or equality. To finish this section, something very important for us is what can be done, no? What public policies can do with this type of information or case studies results. So this integrated analysis of territorial factors and women's characteristics is a difficult challenge for many public organizations. So it is, as the report shows, is showing till 2011, it is easy to see public policies and programs that are both gender blind and space blind. So initiatives to promote greater access of women to jobs and economic assets in order to reduce the gender gap in this dimension, we propose that will be more successful if they consider the specific characteristics of the different territories where women live and where policy or program will have to be applied. To ensure women's economic empowerment, it is necessary, we say, to deal with the structural barriers that limit women's access to income-generating jobs under condition equals for those for men, and which limit their access to productive assets. But it's also necessary to act on the specific dynamics in the territories that make it difficult for women to participate in the territory's economic development. Okay. Now we are going to the section related to Colombia. In this section of our presentation, we want to show how to use the knowledge we generate through research to contribute to changes in policies that can have large-scale impact. As we have said, as I have said at the introduction of this presentation, Rimisp does not do research only to make a scientific contribution to our understanding of society. Our task, our mission is to change the societies we live in ways that are consistent with human rights and with global agreements such as SDGs, the Paris Declaration. Under IDRC supports, during the last years, we have supported the design of large-scale policies that today are already reaching 2.5 million people. And Angela will tell us how to do this, how we are doing it, using some concrete examples of the Colombian public policies we are trying to contribute. Okay.
Thank you very much. Okay, hello everybody. Great to be here. Okay, where we use this knowledge?
Okay, following the peace agreement, Okay. We are working in Colombia in support of the peace building in territories most affected by the 50 years of conflict in my country. In addition, in some of these and other territories, we are supporting a major policy initiative to improve territorial planning at the municipal and departmental level, something equivalent to Canada's provinces. And the first initiative I would like to present are the territorial development programs that is called in the agreement PEDET. The first chapter of the Havana Peace Agreement is dedicated to what is called an integral rural reform. The agreement identified 3 pillars of this rural reform: agrarian laws and programs to deal with issues of access to land, social policy to reduce gaps in well-being between rural and urban people, and the PEDETs to support the development of the territories that are highly affected by the conflict. The PEDET territories include around 190 municipalities with over 7 million people. As you can see in the map, most of the land area is deep rural, but most of the population lives in rural, urban, and urban PEDET territories. As you can see, almost everyone in these places lives in multidimensional poverty. Local governments are weak, and they depend on the national government for the most of their budget. And while agriculture is important, mining is also significant activity in these places. Some of these places contain hugely important and fragile ecosystems. To some extent, the violence of the past decades keep illegal mining or logging away from some of these places. And we must act fast to develop viable economic activities that can coexist with this important ecosystem and in some cases substitute that illegal activities. Next, please. The government of Colombia, through the Office of the High Commissioner of Peace, asked Rimisp to develop the operational guidelines of the PEDETs. What this means is that we have to take the one page of the Havana Peace Agreement that describes the PEDET and come up with very detailed operational guidelines to turn that political statement into real, concrete development for these 7 million people of these territories. As you can imagine, this PEDET needs to start yielding results very soon. And it is critically important that people in these places see that the peace means not just absence of violence, but also development, expanded opportunities, and well-being. We have agreed with the government that the challenge of territorial peace cannot be met using conventional rural development approaches. In particular, this is a very strong agreement that each PEDET will need to be designed, approved, implemented, managed, and governed by the people themselves in each territory. There is no other way to solve the dual equation of peace and development. According to the Havana Agreement, the outcome of each PEDET should be an integral transformation of the territory. For this to happen, the PEDET should be integral and well-coordinated in territorial initiatives, fostering economic, social, and institutional development at the same time. The guidelines are now finished, and have been approved by the government of Colombia. A newly created agency, the Agency for Territorial Renewal, has been charged with putting the PEDET into practice, and Rimisp fully expects to continue to be an active participant in this process, obviously with the support of IDRC. Not all development problems in Colombia are due to the 5 decades of violent conflict. One long-standing issue is the misuse of our territory and the resources therein. Like many Latin American countries, Colombia has a territorial planning law that ought to ensure that we use our land and other resources in a carefully sustainable and civilized manner. Unfortunately, the law has not been enough, and you can see in this slide some of the examples of the mess that we have in my country. For example, there are cities like Mocoa that were built in places that are subject to landslides, resulting in the death of more than 300 people just a few days ago. Forests are destroyed, and there is pollution in our waters. There isn't enough space left for public facilities. Our city grows over some of our best agricultural land, and we farm slow that that easily erode. Less than 5% of Colombia's municipalities have territorial plans that make provisions for the rural areas, and not even one municipality has a plan that takes into consideration rural and urban issues. To correct this problem, Colombia's National Planning Department, DNP, has started an initiative called Modern Territorial Planning Program. The objective is to have 1,000 Colombian municipalities with proper territorial plans that fully take into account the rural areas and the rural-urban linkages. The program has started with 108 municipalities this year, with a total population of 7 million, two-thirds of which live in condition of multidimensional poverty. The DNP has asked Rimisp to first develop the guidelines for how to do this, second, to train 400 staff of the municipalities, third, to verify that these new plans meet the technical standards defined in the guidelines, and finally, to provide a help desk service to support the municipalities in the coming 2 years in dealing with these issues derived from the planning process or the plans themselves. We are almost finished with the first task of developing the guidelines, and we are going to start the training program in June. So, with the output of the project, we want to attend the urban and rural interface in the planning process, thinking as one of the matters that can influence the imbalances correction between rural and urban zones, foster the rural development considering that it goes beyond agricultural development, reduce poverty and close the rural and urban gaps in terms of access to services and good use in the urban and rural needs for a better provision. Promote more democracy and participation of communities in the planning process of their territory and at a better articulation among local, regional, and national level. Contribute to the land ownership process, recognizing that it is a crucial step for an effective use of land and a condition for the reconciliation and the peace building. Finally, considering that the territory is the same and is finite, the territorial plans are an important vehicle to solve conflicts and to foster the sustainable use of land. Thank you very much. And now, Ignacia will finish our presentation.
Okay. Yes, don't worry. To finish our presentation, I want to take a few more minutes of your attention. Just to tell you, okay, thank you. To tell you that all of this work, like everything else we do in Rimisp, is done through a very strong collaboration with a wide diversity of public and private organizations, local, national, regional, and international. For example, here you have the Transforming Territories program supported by the IDRC, partners in the implementation process, 22 partners by the list working with us in this process. This is why we like to define ourselves as a network that links and generates knowledge for the development of Latin American territories. We are a network and not a simple organization or institution. IDRC has been all important not only in supporting this organizational development of Rimisp as an organization. Perhaps more important, you have stimulated and encouraged and created the necessary space to become more capable for us of carrying out our mission or achieving our objectives. We have donors and we have partners, and we value you as a partner. The difference is in the way you work with us. And we ask you to remain true to this culture that has proven for us to be so important in our organizational development capacities. And just to finish, just the last one in the same sense to thankful you for the work we have been doing together. Here you can see what we are now. The funding generation of Rimisp is moving away. We are now in a new stage of Rimisp history. 10 years ago, when you decide to invest and to make the decision to invest in Rimisp organizational development, Rimisp was a group of eight principal researchers, 7 of them men, all of them in their 50s, and now we are what you can see there. You have helped us to shape this, a diverse group of men and women in many countries, in many disciplines, different backgrounds, all of them full of passions and ideas to continue working with you. And so many thanks to you for making this possible.
Great.
Okay? Thank you.
Gracias, Ignacia, Angela, and Julio. Always a pleasure. Now, we have about 20 minutes, and I know I have questions, but I think given the time, I'm happy to invite you to bring questions from the floor if you have questions for our guests. But while you consider your questions, perhaps I will begin with a question. Ah oui, puis vous pouvez poser vos questions en français si vous...
And you can ask your questions in French if you want. We have simultaneous interpretation.
No simultaneous.
I think we can get you some, or I can translate for you.
What do you prefer?
That's fine. Stay there.
Okay.
So tell us, for the way forward now, that you have seen the power of strong analysis and science in presenting convincing evidence to policymakers. Where do you see the work going in the next 10 years?
Okay. Okay, many thanks for the question, because it's something we have been reflecting during these days together with you. And I think, I don't know, maybe the most important thing to say is that we are planning to, we are changing the way we do our research decisions. Here you have Julio, and here you have Julio, and his personal leadership has been fundamental for the development of Rimisp during his history. But now we are constructing a more collective leadership. So we are working together in define the future agenda, the research agenda, and also contribution to public changes agenda. So I can tell you two things that for me personally is very important in mind for the future, but as I am saying, we will collectively build this future agenda. Under this general approach of territorial development, that is, of course, we share and we will continue working in it, I think there is at least two very important issues to take into account, thinking especially in the Latin American situation and political windows of opportunity and, I don't know, demand of the countries for this future. First of all, has to do with the first issue has to do with the quality of our democracy as our policy process. Latin America faces a lot of problems of lack of transparency, corruption, decision-making process not as open and transparent as we would like to. And we have developed some tools like policy dialogue tools, policy engagement tools, participation tools that we want to put in common with governments and with other partners to develop a more inclusive process to policy building. I insist, under the general scope of territorial development in our themes, but with new methods and new ways of approach to this process. And the other theme that is very important in our future agenda is related to vulnerable groups. We're talking about gender, youth, indigenous population that tend to face, that we saw there with this information about the Latin American report, double, triple exclusions process, gender exclusion. If you are a women, gender, youth, and you live in a lag territory, so the situation is really black, no? So to think together in these different exclusions that superposed one to each other is something very important in the future of the Rimisp research agenda.
Indeed. Good. And if you have questions, please go to the mic, and I'm happy to entertain your questions.
Piracy.
And please do us the pleasure of introducing yourself.
Good afternoon.
It's on. Wait, it's on. should be on.
Thank you. My name is Jan Boon. I'm retired. I don't represent anybody but myself. I really found your presentation fascinating. I'd never thought about the rural-urban interface this way. And to tell you the truth, in my head, I had the old-fashioned idea, and thank you for correcting it. While I was listening, what I was thinking about is Canada is a mining country. And there are many mining companies active in Colombia. And the mining industry has realized that it can make a huge contribution to development. There's actually a map came out that maps the Sustainable Development Goals against mining. And my question would be, and I would suspect that much of the mining is in the rural side, that it's not in the interface. But still, if the mining companies are serious, they bring resources. Your work is very important and it needs resources. And would there be any opportunity to work together? Because some of the tools that you mentioned, I'm dead sure, would be very useful to mining companies. They could learn a lot from you. Thank you.
Maybe Angela can
Yes.
take the question.
Definitely, mining is a rural activity in Colombia also. Rural-urban activity. And I think that is the issue is to find a way to do sustainable mining processes in rural and urban areas that provide enough resources to the cities or to the municipalities. And I think the main problem in Colombia is not the mining like an industry, a formal industry. The main problem with mining in Colombia is the illegal mining. Okay, that's the point. And normally the industry can work with the communities, with the municipalities, and that is very, very important. But a very big, a big part of this activity, is where the conflict were, especially in the Pacific part of Colombia, and the government don't have enough capacity to go there or to went there at that moment. So definitely, I think that it is possible, and rural and urban interface, and these tools provide a good set of instruments for that.
And has there been any opportunity for Rimisp, either in Colombia or in other parts of the region, to engage with industry groups around the type of analysis that you have been doing? Has this been a conversation between mining companies and Rimisp?
We are just starting some kind of work in this direction. For example, in Chile, with, how do you say ONU Mujeres in English?
UN Women.
UN Women. They are the grantees for the tech mining company. Here is a Canadian who is investing in Chile, in the north of the Chile, and minor part of the country. And we are working with the UN Women in territorial development plans with a very conflictive zone. Population communities with mining corporation is very not easy relation, especially taking into account women and indigenous women population in this zone. So it's still a small project, but it is opening us the door to make a more collaborative relation, collaborative and conflictive cooperation with private investment. For example, in Chile, now we are now.
Excellent. You said, Angela, something that I found and that if Jean has tweeted it, I hope he has, that development and that inclusive, sustainable, equitable development is key to peace, to keeping the peace. And I'm sure that this is not only the case in Colombia, but everywhere.
Yes.
But tell us about that inclusive and sustainable angle of what the territorial approach can bring. We've seen much in the news about the peace agreement. We've seen many men in these discussions. But certainly the participation of women in this economic development is going to be important, as well as an eye to the sustainability of that economic development.
Okay, probably the main challenge in the post-conflict agenda, now the new era for Colombia, I think is the coordination between national and rural organizations in these territories. And the territorial approach brings like a framework or many tools to solve the problem of coordination in these territories. It is very, very important, the participation process and the decision making. And we have a new risk in this process that the traditional politics take this process in their hands. And for example, women, indigenous people, and poor people cannot participate in this decision process. Therefore, we are thinking in new elements of coordination that privilege the women, the indigenous, and the vulnerable people in the decision process making. And that is very important, for example, to have budget for this decision, and that the people decide about this budget. This is a special point, and it's very new in my country, at least.
Indeed, so there's quite a lot of work still to do. And although there is a peace, it is a fragile peace.
Yes.
And in order to have that sustained peace, then the development must come. Julio, I know we have met more often in places. We have never met where you are, and we have always met in other places where you are working, including in Africa. And you mentioned in the earlier part of your conversation that this very striking new way of looking at the rural-urban interface is not just a characteristic of Latin America, but it is also certainly in Asia and in Africa. Tell us from your experience how you are understanding perhaps what Latin Americans and Remisp's experience in Latin America can bring to some of the challenges we are facing in this agricultural transformation, in particular, the rural transformation in Africa.
Well, I think Africa faces a special challenge of making its rural transformation to be socially inclusive. I think it's going to be more difficult in Africa than in any other place for a number of reasons. First, because the enormous number of youth which are entering each year into the labor markets and trying to start their own lives. You're talking, I forget the numbers, but some of you might remember the numbers. It's millions of young Africans every single year. The challenge of providing opportunities, even basic opportunities for this number of people, I don't think that the world has ever seen something of this magnitude. It was certainly not the case of the European experience or the North American experience or even Latin America, where a lot of the transformation happened when we were already being successful in our population and birth control and reproductive rights policies, right? We never had this coexistence of this enormous population growth with the transformation process. So that's the first reason. Second is because manufacturing is disappearing all over the place. We see this early drop in manufacturing, and that was supposed to be the way that rural youth that wanted to go outside agriculture would move, right? Well, there's no longer that option. It's basically closed. Third, I should say, and I realize how difficult this process is, but let's contrast it with Europe. When Europe did its rural transformation in the 19th century, You know, a lot of people went from agriculture to manufacturing, et cetera, et cetera. But many, many more people went from agriculture in Europe to agriculture in Canada, in the United States, and Australia. The rural transformation, the very successful transformation, rural transformation of Europe, was made possible because people were able to move and migrate. Correct? It's the same in the United States, Australia, et cetera, et cetera. Today, Africa, well, you know the tragedy of the immigration story, all over the place. Yeah? Instead of a process where people can go and find opportunities elsewhere, unfortunately, we now face a world where people talk about building walls. So it's a massive task which needs to be done in place for just about everybody. I don't know how that can be sorted out. Now, a few, and with this I finish because I've taken too long. One, people do not need to leave the rural areas in order to diversify their opportunities in the economies. This idea that in order to transform African rural societies, you need to shift massive amounts of people to Johannesburg and Lagos, that's not true. You know, you can foster this type of rural-urban societies, but we need to get decision makers, those who have authority over allocation of budgets, to say, folks, you need to strengthen these ties. You need to build infrastructure. You need to strengthen local governments. You need to make sure that there's a governance system so that the city can work together with the rural municipalities or districts, et cetera, et cetera. There's issues of urban planning that impact on this process. But I think that's a very important story. That's a very important story. Let's recognize this rural-urban interface, invest there, and I think it can help Africa meet at least a part of the challenge, perhaps not all, because, by gosh, they really have a difficult situation to meet.
Une question.
Thank you for a fascinating presentation. I'm John Graham, various organizations, Foreign Service, OAS, and sometimes the Carter Center. It's a question about the role of local government in meeting your objectives. And it's the quality of the linkage between communities that you've described and municipal government can be very important in success or failure. So I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about how that's developing. It's the structure, whether the governments that these communities are dealing with largely are appointed, are they elected, how effective are they? Thank you.
Great question. And perhaps I'll take a second one as well if we have time, and then you can answer as a group. And I've been told that we actually have a whole additional half hour, so we're under a little bit less pressure to go quickly.
It's dangerous to let me know about that extra half hour.
For the answers, more than the question.
Of course, for the question. No, I'll try and restrain myself.
For the next question.
Those of you who know me, my name is Joshua Ramesh. I work at Joshua Ramesh, and I work at the University of Ottawa in the School of International Development and Global Studies. And my work is actually in Africa on rural-urban migration. So my first question is a bit of a methodological issue that I was just to maybe again I'm very intrigued and very happy to see this urbanization idea being foregrounded, and I would just say that I would assume that many of the challenges that we deal with in the African context are also here in Latin America, where you have, it's not at the household level, it's within the household, that we have multi-locational households. So the fact that somebody has a rural light on in your nighttime map of Mexico doesn't necessarily reflect the places of activity or even location, the contacts. I mean, I think there's obviously a longer conversation there. But the fact that, the fact that we have greater capacity to be networked over longer distances means that, again, there might be a foot in the rural area, but there might be feet in multiple rural areas and multiple urban areas, however we define them. So I think that's just sort of a caveat or a thing that I maybe hear you comment on. My question, though, is related to the slide that you showed that said, how does this affect smallholders in Chile? And I agree. Chile, Uruguay, these are places where the process is much more further along if we accept it as a linear transformation. But definitely where the transformation from 1990 up until the last data set, you saw the smallholders were affected Commercial farmers were very much affected. But if I read the numbers correctly, there was only a 6% increase in the farm workers. So that's a challenge. What were the other benefits? It looked like no one was benefiting commensurate with the losses. The other thing is, and again, I know Chile less, but certainly across the zone, and you alluded to this in your previous answer, deindustrialization is a challenge. I mean, we're talking about this as an African context, but Latin America as well. We're living through this transformation profoundly. And I think there is obviously a rise of service and other sectors of the economy. But again, maybe within the data sets that you have in front of you, just to talk about that a bit more, because you alluded to it and it's hinted at, but it's quite tantalizing. And I think represents major challenges for the Southern Cone as well. So thanks very much for a great opportunity.
Okay, so we have governance and responsiveness of local and national governments in Mexico and Colombia and other places you have tried. And then we have some nitty-gritty, as Jean would say, questions about what we're really able to say based on the data that you have. So I don't know who wants to tackle what in that.
Ignacia directs the traffic here.
Okay,
all right. Thank you.
We go with the municipality.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll deal with Joshua's, if you'd like me to call you Joshua's, questions. Thank you for your detailed observation of our data sets and our work. Well, what you describe about multi-location households and people really not living in one place but in many places, it's absolutely right. And it actually, I think, strengthens our argument that this idea, that people are rural because they live in a rural village and they live in that house and they work within 5 kilometers around that house and they never that's, I don't know if it was ever true, but it's been a long time that it's simply not true. Absolutely not true today. I mean, there is a very, very small proportion of people that still live in extremely remote, extremely isolated areas. Fortunately, there's very few. By a parenthesis here, in Mexico, there's 3% of the total population that are living in really, really distant and isolated. Now, 3%. Extreme, the highest levels of poverty in Mexico. And the problem is that these 3%, they live in 189,000 different villages. There you have a challenge. How do we provide basic services, which are, I guess, a human right today, basic education, basic health, to these people in highly remote, huge number of places. I suspect that's also the case in Africa. I am not sure. But anyway, the end of the parenthesis. So yes, multi-location is true. People live in much more. The issue, well, you're an expert in migration. I won't tell you that, but perhaps for the rest of the audience. The idea of migration of people moving from the countryside to a large city for good, that story, it's an old story, and it's largely finished in Latin America. People come and go, and there's circular migration. They migrate for 6 months and come back. They come to the United States, and when the economic cycle goes the other way around, they return. It's a very different migration pattern. So all of these contributes to this dense network of interdependencies between the rural and the urban. Farm workers, who's benefiting? Yes, farm workers did not really increase. Everybody decreased. Now, I think that as the rural transformation means that a lot of people will leave agriculture. The total number of people working in agriculture will decrease, whether they're small farmers, medium farmers, farm workers. It does decrease in aggregate, right? Now, each of them is far more productive than the previous generation. Take the case of Brazil. I don't have the exact numbers, and I'm going to invent a little bit the numbers, but the proportions are more or less right, okay? 50 years ago, 45% of the Brazilian economy was agriculture. But the total value in today's dollars of that 45% was some $11 billion. Today, the Brazilian agricultural economy is far smaller in proportion to the total size of the economy. But the size, the absolute number, is 20 or 30 times what it used to be, those 11 billion. So we're talking here about a relative decrease in the importance of agriculture. Look at Canada. What's the value of the agricultural economy of Canada? Many billions of dollars, I am sure. I don't have the number. Probably larger than it was if you converted at the time of the prairies, where everybody was a farmer, right? So the relative size shrinks, but the total size of the pie increases. So who's winning? How are they winning? Because in Chile, we do see a dramatic decrease in poverty, in rural poverty, dramatic increase in rural, and very fast. Who's winning? Well, they're becoming something else. We saw the data for women in Colombia. They start to work in the manufacturing sector. They start to work in commerce. They open businesses. They open shops. And many of them stay in agriculture. Deindustrialization is also an issue, of course, in Latin America. It's an issue all over the place. Right now, we have 24 million youth in the 19 Spanish and Portuguese-speaking countries of Latin America. 24 million youth who don't study and don't work. And then we are surprised because we see the drug issues and the criminal issues and the violence. Why should we be surprised? 24 million youth. No hope. No way out. No road ahead of them. So yes, deindustrialization. Yes, the services sector grows. And you see the services numbers and say, wow, it's a service-based economy. A lot of the services is shoe shining, and selling gum in the street. That's trade, commerce. It's classified as a service activity, service sector activity. But it's really poor, very poor, low quality, low pay, lousy life conditions, no opportunity. So services and good jobs is no longer equivalent, unfortunately. Local governments.
Okay. The role of the municipalities and the local governments. Okay. I think it is a fact that many people live in small and medium cities, and the majority of these people are poor. And the other factor is that the institutional capacity is very, very weak. So we need policies that improve social and economic outputs, definitely. But in these cases of these cities, we need to strengthen local governments because it is the only way to make sustainable these outcomes in terms of social and development outcomes. And what does it mean? Better coordination, transparency, capacity, and to drive these conditions to a better democracy conditions for these people in these small cities. In my opinion, I think it's the only way to make sustainable the territorial development approach in the rural and urban areas in Latin America and probably also in Africa.
Question? Maybe we'll take another couple of questions.
Hi, my name is Philippa Weens from the Canadian Cooperative Association. I work on programming in Colombia. So coming back to the concept of territorial development, or the ordenamiento territorial, I wanted to know if you might be able to give us an example of a successful case of this kind of development. I know in Colombia there's this goal of by 2018 that there's going to be a lot more of this happening. And when you think of the fact that the initial concept was born of the reality that there's conflict between uso and vocación, between use and vocation. Vocation of land is often top-down, and use is bottom-up. And you have this conflicting visions of vocation of land use. So have you had examples, have you seen examples in the Colombian context where this is really working, where populations are really being included in the development of their territorial planning, and where you really see this conflict and this distinct visions of the use of vocation actually being resolved?
That's a good question. You can think about that.
Hi.
My name is Catalina. I don't have any fancy title. And just to continue a little bit with the professor's question, this is to Julio. When you talked and you showed that fancy graphic, and you said that in the case of Chile, that the small farmer wasn't really hurt by this interface. And I wonder, because you already said the statistics, and maybe I'm not sure if I understood correctly, it's only 35 that went to commercial farmers. So you said that they weren't that low, so the small farmers weren't that hurt. So I wonder if those commercial farmers that seems to be lower, but actually have more power. So actually, if their share of the economy is way bigger, their bargaining power bigger, and how that impacts the smaller farmers. And also, if you can refer a little bit about the informal economy, because everywhere is about where they go or where they don't go. As you said, it's either the trade on the street or selling gums, especially with women. What about the informal economy, how that impacts their well-being?
Ooh, good question. And why don't we take the third question as well? Thank you for your question. Oops.
Thank you. My name is Paola Ortiz, and I'm also I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Ottawa. And I would like to problematize a little bit the idea of productivity and rural transformation. And when we saw, the nice graph on urbanization, where the productivity gets closer to the urban levels, in the developed countries, I would like to see there also where the land property, is. Like, is there more land concentration there, because I think it tells us a lot about, how can we really measure, the rural transformation in terms of economic value or livelihoods or, who gets access to land or this type of, productivity, life. So I would like to hear more about that. Thank you.
We have great questions. So we have, has this worked somewhere? Colombia in particular, but if not Colombia, elsewhere. And this bottom-up, top-down idea of who determines the use of the land, if I have that more or less right. And then we have very good questions about understanding more about what happened to those smallholders, yes, and the transition. And another question, your question with yes, how much land is actually there in some of these places and that dimension. And you've probably heard more than what I've been able to distill. I'm just buying time so that they can think about how they're going to answer. Ignacia, do you want to start?
Yes, let me start with a general assessment about the question about the successful case, and then Angela can talk about the Colombia situation. We used to talk about this successful case of territorial development by two different entry points. One is the one related to the outcomes, results of the process, and from this point of view, we have been working on territories that have three common elements: economic growth, poverty reduction, and inequality reduction, Gini. So we have mapped some years ago, I don't know, 10% of the municipalities, 12% of the municipalities that has these three situations at the same time. So then we can say, well, there are territories that are successful in, we can say, development, approximate about development with this dimension: growth, poverty reduction, and inequality reduction. But then maybe the most important dimension, more than this, related to outcomes, has to be with the processes. No? What kind of process, institutions, dynamics are inside the territories to explain these outcomes? And in this way, I will not make reference to any concrete territory. Angela maybe will do this. But just to say that we have found that several cases analysis we have been analyzing some general conditions that tend to be present in different combinations, but tend to be present in all over the territories, these 12% of territories, okay? And these conditions have to do with some structural conditions, for example, more relation with markets in the rural areas of these territories, better distribution of land property in these territories, and some others, but also not only with this kind of structural situation, but also with the kind of social engagement of civil society. We talk about social coalitions and the role that social coalitions, actors, plays in this development process. No? If all the structural things goes good, fine, but without people engagement in this development process, we never found results of as good as we would like to. This is in general terms. Maybe Angela can talk about Colombia's cases.
This is a very, very good question. I think I can answer this question in two ways. First, showing some projects or some initiatives that have worked, especially in Colombia, in Santander. The territorial planning is around water, and they took the decisions in terms to have better conditions for all the territory and all the communities. The other example that I want to say, probably is not the way that you make the question, is that we have very, very strong evidence that the territorial planning or ordenamiento territorial works in the cities, in urban cities. And we have made sustainable cities, and the people improve their conditions with strong speed in less than 10 years. So why don't think similar things for rural zones? And that makes the difference between opportunities and access to other services. And the other issue is that, the cities have relations with the rural zones, and rural zones have relations with the cities. So that is a very issue for territorial planning. And just one comment about the problem of concentration. Our approach is that the titles or this problem with the property, at least in Colombia, that is a big problem, is also also territorial problem. And the only way to solve that is including this problem in a more comprehensive approach. I think that the problem of the land in Colombia or the land in Latin America is an isolated problem. I think that's the mistake. So we call that in ordenamiento de la propiedad. I don't know really how to say that in English. It's an important part of territorial planning.
Good. Well, thank you for the questions on the data. I mean, success stories of territorial development, unfortunately, are not very many, because like Ignacia says, we know that less than 12% of the territories that we have looked, and we have looked at around 10,000 of them, were, in quote-unquote, successful in different dimensions, not just of economic growth, but also of social inclusion. You can read that in two ways, right? One is that there's very few that achieve inclusive growth, essentially. And then if you add the question of environmental sustainability, well, that number drops from 12 to something else, 12% to something less. So, I mean, that's not an encouraging result. But the other way to look at it is this small number, this 12%, demonstrate that it is possible. That it's not just a dream and a utopia to be pursued endlessly forever. That it actually can happen. right? On today in these countries, not just in the big countries, the Brazils, or also we have some of these success stories in. So yes, we have 12% of them. Fortunately, not very many. All right, going to the questions by Catalina and Paola. I was trying to see if I could find in my iPad, my files here, the study where we have the numbers from the smallholders, because we did look at the share, not just the number of households, like you rightly pointed out, but how did the share of the total agricultural income in the country change over time between these three groups: farmers, wage workers, commercial farmers, and small farmers. I could not find it, but I will find the study, and if you give me your email, I will send it to you. I don't remember the numbers to be able to tell you something, all right? Now, I do know that there has been a shift in the allocation of the total agricultural income, and that the most favored group has been the salaried wage workers in agriculture. It doesn't mean that they have become the richest group. The commercial farmers continue to be many times richer on average than anybody else. Inequality is still very high. But the ones that have made the largest gains are the farm workers, not so much the smallholders. All right? That has to do with the characteristics of Chilean agriculture. It's very labor-intensive, fruits, wines, etc. So it's not. It would be different if we were producing grains or something else. I'll come back to the informal economy at the end. Is there increased concentration of land as this process occurs? In Latin America, the answer is yes. We have a recent study, not by us, it's an FAO study. I'm not just giving publicity to my new job, but it is an FAO study. And it shows that, yes, the gene is getting worse in Latin America as a whole. Right? Now, what we have learned, Paola, is that we need to take these average numbers and open what we call the black box of the national average. In highly unequal society, in Canada, if you look at the average income, it tells a story of a large majority of the Canadians. In Latin America, if you look at the average income, it doesn't tell the story of a large proportion of the Latin Americans because the inequality is so huge. Same issue with land. So on the whole, we're going backwards. Now, what happens when we start to disaggregate these numbers region by region, area by area? I don't have the answer, but I would suppose, Paola, that you see two situations. One situation where you have increased concentration of land, areas of great agricultural dynamism, for example, the Cerrados of Brazil, or right? Probably greater concentration, bigger operations, fewer farmers, the Pampas in Argentina and so forth. You see probably also many, many territories where you see a reduction in the average size of farms, how can you say it, Renaud? The fracturing of land into fragmentation of land into time. Our land inheritance systems, it has to do with cultural norms and values, very difficult to change, imply that if a family has 3 children, the land is split by 3. Right? And the next generation, it's again split by 2, and by the end of 20 years, you end up with... So I am sure, Paola, that there's many areas where we're seeing a tremendous process of fragmentation that probably, quote-unquote, is reducing inequality. Because now everybody has a tiny little plot of land, probably. Okay? But the overall picture is not encouraging. Informal economy. Well, in Mexico, after, it's a rich country by World Bank and UN standards. It's actually a high-income economy, et cetera, 57%. of the workers are in the informal economy. So it's, I mean, the informal economy is basically the economy, all right? In some of these places, when we saw these deep greens, these good areas of good economic growth and more social inclusion in Colombia, one territory at the Angela is not going to like this, but too bad. One territory. Let me get to that map. Yeah. Come on. Yeah. This place here at the foremost left corner is called Tumaco. A lot of economic growth, a lot of social inclusion. Most of it is the drug trade, right? And not only informal, but illegal economy. So dark green is not only good, or it's very dark green. Yeah. Anyway, I guess you also have places like that in the West, which are... Anyway. So, yes, the informal economy is a huge issue and a lot of... Now, not all of it is... And this is very important for Africa. At least I read about that. And I think I've seen it. We have this idea that the informal economy is bad and that it must be, we need policies to get out of the informal economy as soon as possible. And if you're talking about shoe shining and you say, well, that's not a way for a household to build a livelihood on the basis of shining shoes or selling, chewing gum on the street. But a lot of the formal economy is not this type of informal economy. There are shops, there are mechanics, there's, these are proper household-based businesses, which make a very, very rational choice to not go formal because the costs, the transaction costs of going formal are just too large, right? So they are in the informal economy because it makes all the economic sense in the world. They might not be poor people. They might not be at least destitute people. They're in the formal economy. But I think we need to also change our lens about how we look at the informal economy, because there's the informal economy that doesn't take anybody anywhere. And there's this informal economy that is stuck there just because we have too much corruption, we have too much bribery, which have too much bureaucracy. Try to get a permit to open a shop in Honduras. It's easier to climb the Everest. I mean, it's extremely difficult and costly, and you need to pay bribes all along the way, etc. So that's about the informal economy.
Great. Thank you. Yes, I know. Gracias. So I'm only going to add a few words to what Jean talked about at the beginning to introduce this session. Absolutely, as you've heard from Julio, Angela, and Ignacia, this project that is now Rimisp, a large endeavor, is an example that brings together all the things that IDRC believes in and puts forward. You see it above Julio and Angela's head, knowledge based on evidence from a large number, 10,000 areas that you have collected data on. The innovation of thinking about this as an entry point to inform better policy, better development policy, and the solution that then brings in the context of the post-conflict situation in Colombia and many other places potentially going forward. This is emblematic of the kind of work that IDRC supports. Strong research and evidence that then contributes to better decision making and solutions for the people who then benefit from those those better decisions. In addition, it's a great pleasure as well to be able to point to Rimisp as an emblem of IDRC's emphasis on partnership, because not only is your story partly a story of IDRC's partnership with this small organization that's now a large, very influential regional organization. So that partnership, but also the partnership values that you bring into your model of the organization and the network, and how important the partnership message is going forward. And I think when we think about the Sustainable Development Goals, even the international community has recognized in Goal 17 that partnership is essential for sustainable development to really be sustainable. So these ideas that are coming together, the leadership of Rimisp, and very clear transformative work that you have not only generated from the findings, but also then been brave, taken risks, and gone into this policy influencing space that is an uncomfortable space for science organizations often, but that you have gone there, built the trust and the buy-in from your clients, and elevated this work to a position where it can actually make a huge difference. We were talking about 2.5 million people already being reached by new policies. Now, whether those new policies will actually transform their lives still remains to be seen, but that the reach that you can have when you take risks and try things is really a evidence of your success. And we are grateful to have been part of that journey. We have learned a lot, and Renaud and Delphine and the team are constantly pulling stories from Rimisp and trying to weave them more explicitly into our thinking about how we move forward as well, and how we can build on these ideas in other regions. So thank you.
Thank you very
Please
much.
join me in thanking.